So part one, just the definition and the risk factors. So if I asked you what cancer is, I'm sure all of you will give me this standard reply, which is it's a state in which cells divide uncontrollably. One thing to remember is that cancer is a complex disease. It's not a single condition. It's a whole series of things which happen, which is primarily driven by these abnormal cells which divide uncontrollably. That's true. And they also invade nearby tissues. What I've also given you on this slide is a very quick recap on the types of common cancers. So carcinomas is the most common. Almost 80% of all cancers typically are carcinomas, which primarily involve epithelial cells, typically in the skin or in tissues. Less common is sarcomas, which is primarily derived from connective tissues such as bone, cartilage, muscle, blood vessels, etc. The third category is leukemias, which relies primarily on hematopoietic cells or the blood cell types in the bone marrow. And the last one are the lymphomas and the myelomas, which essentially are cells of the immune system that are disrupted in their regulation and differentiation. Now, if you think about it, cancer is not uncommon at all. In fact, almost every known species on the planet develops tumors. Even plants develop tumors, as you can see in this canker that you see on the branch of this tree. Even dinosaur fossils have been found with tumors. Now here I would like to pause and ask you to think a little. Do you know of any species that doesn't develop cancer? There is one, just the one. Okay? And here's the answer. Some might think elephants, and some were talking about whales, but actually the only known species which, well, controversial, there's some recent evidence, but we think that the naked mole rat is the only species on the planet not to develop cancer. It's quite an ugly little thing. It's a mammal. It's nocturnal. It lives in burrows under the ground, comes out only at night. It's hairless. And actually, for its body mass, it lives almost 300 years in human terms. So it's very, very long-lived. And several research evidence suggests that this naked mole rat is the only species that doesn't develop tumors. And there's a lot of research going on as to why this may happen. And one hypothesis is that this naked mole rat has a very special type of molecule called hyaluronan, and it's a very high molecular mass hyaluronan, which means that the cells in these naked mole rat are especially sticky. They're very thick. And that's probably one of the reasons why the animal doesn't grow very big. But also another reason could be for its insensitivity to developing tumors. What is known, however, especially as humans are concerned, is that if you look at the data, and this is a very useful website, I'd highly recommend you have a look at this, cancerresearchuk.org, where it gives you a lot of stats in terms of incidence versus survival. So what is the frequency of certain types of cancers occurring in the human population? And if you look at this, the data clearly shows that almost more than 300,000 cases of cancer were diagnosed in 2 years from 15 to 17. And out of these, the most common are breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, or bowel cancer in the UK. And it's very common the longer we live. So among 85-plus-year-olds, the incidences or the risk of developing cancers is very high. So that's the incidence. But if you look at the survival, the news is really good. If you look at the survival rates for large or a vast majority of the common cancers, survival is 10 years or more. at least in England and Wales. And the statistics, if you think of the past 40 years, it's incredibly improved. It's almost doubled in the past 40 years. Of course, this depends on the type of cancer. So there's a huge variation in the types of cancers that you have. But the risk of getting tumors is largely preventable. If you look at the data, almost 4 in 10 cancers in the UK can be prevented. Let me show you some interesting stats globally. So if you look at the global data, what you see on the top is the incidences of common cancers across the world in males, and below is the incidence in females. So it's very clear across the globe, especially in the Americas, parts of Africa, Australia, and the developed countries, and parts of Europe, the most common type of cancer is lung cancer, whereas in parts of China, it's more liver cancers, lung cancers, sorry. Whereas in females, if you look at the incidences, the most common types of cancers are breast cancers. One interesting point here is if you look at Mongolia, this bit in green, males and females have a higher risk of developing liver cancers, as opposed to China, which is lung cancers, and parts of China also have lung cancers common in males and females. So what this suggests is that the risk of developing certain types of cancers is largely driven by our lifestyle and exposure to certain mutagens and carcinogens. So the lifetime risk, the statistics in the UK, is that 1 in 2 of us will be diagnosed with cancer in our lifetime. But almost half of these can be prevented. 38% of cancers in the UK, at least, are preventable because it links to how our diet and our lifestyle, for example, obesity and lack of exercise are very two high risk factors for developing certain types of colon cancer, for example. Exposure to ultraviolet radiation from sunlight, that increases the risk of getting skin cancers, melanomas. Exposure to, or rather, smoking is a very strong correlation with developing lung cancers. Exposure to asbestos in the lung, this is an occupational hazard, so that can increase the risk of getting certain types of lung cancers. I've also put this image of burnt toast here, and I don't want you to go away and think that you're never going to eat burnt toast if you do like it. All I'm trying to say is that you see those black bits, and even in barbecued meats, sometimes you get that. So these contain hydrocarbons, and there has been a correlation that, again, genetics combined with a long-term exposure to these hydrocarbons can increase the risk of getting certain types of colon cancer. So it's a risk factor combined with genetics that plays a part. But the biggest risk factor of all is age. The longer we live, the likelihood of getting certain types of cancers is higher, especially in the 85 plus. If you look at this data, what it clearly shows you is the incidence increases with age. And this is common in females as well as in males. There are certain types of cancers that are inherited, but they are relatively rare. Less than 1 to 2% of cancers are actually inherited. And what I've given you an example here is a type of tumor that develops in the eye, in the retina, called as a retinoblastoma. And here you see this child, in the old days when you used to take photographs in the analog cameras, sometimes you get this red eye effect, whereas if there is a tumor, this was picked up by through this lens, and therefore you can see the tumor develop. But the good news is that these sort of pediatric or childhood retinoblastomas are have very good prognosis because it's simple surgery that removes the tumor, and it's a very good prognosis in the future too. What I've shown you here is how this develops, the genetics of it. Essentially, it's a inherited risk of a mutation in a single gene called as the retinoblastoma gene, RB. And if you have a biallelic mutation, that means to both copies are mutants, then the risk of getting retinoblastoma is higher. So I want to end at this stage on just giving you a brief overview of some of the risk factors associated with cancer development. In part 2, I'll talk about the genetic hallmarks.